Pick it up. Daniel Carter didn't raise his voice when he said it, and somehow that made the room feel even colder. The words slid across the 40-foot conference table like a blade wrapped in silk, quiet enough to sound civilized, sharp enough to stop every breath in the room. Ava Johnson stood near the glass wall with a cleaning cart beside her, one hand still resting on the chrome handle, the other holding a microfiber cloth gown still between her fingers. At her feet lay the stack of legal documents Daniel had just let slip from his hand, not dropped by accident, not quite thrown, but placed on the polished marble floor with the kind of precision only powerful men ever seemed to master. For one suspended second, nobody moved. The executives seated around the table stared into laptops they were no longer reading. A woman in a cream blazer tightened her jaw and looked away. Someone near the far end gave a nervous half-laugh that died almost instantly beneath the hum of recessed lights and the faint click of rain against the 32nd floor windows. Outside, Manhattan was blurred silver and gray, the skyline half swallowed by weather. But inside Carter Global Holdings, everything remained painfully clear. Daniel stood at the head of the table in a charcoal suit tailored so cleanly it looked almost unforgiving, his cufflinks catching the white overhead light each time he shifted his wrist. He was the kind of man who didn't have to announce authority because the room had already built itself around it. His name was on the building. His portrait hung in the lobby. His voice moved markets before lunch. And right now, that voice had landed on Ava like a test no one else in the room was brave enough to acknowledge. She looked down at the papers. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the marble beside them, distorted by the floor's polished sheen and the long fluorescent line of light overhead. The cleaning badge clipped to her navy uniform rested against her chest, slightly bent from years of use. The left sleeve of her cardigan had begun to fray at the wrist. Her shoes, black, practical, bought on clearance 6 months ago, made no sound as she bent slowly at the knees. She should have picked the documents up and moved on. That's what everyone expected. That's what invisible people were trained to do. Quiet hands, lowered eyes, no opinions, no interruptions. Just clean around the mess and keep the day moving. But then her fingers brushed the top page. And she stopped. It was subtle, so subtle most people would have missed it. A single clause halfway down the page, buried inside a block of legal language dense enough to make even smart people skim. Ava's eyes narrowed. Her hand froze just above the paper. The air around her seemed to thin. Somewhere behind her, the coffee machine in the corner hissed softly as it finished brewing a fresh pot no one would remember to drink. Daniel glanced at his watch, already irritated by the delay. "Is there a problem?" he asked, and this time there was the faintest edge beneath the smoothness. Ava didn't answer right away. Her eyes remained fixed on the page. Her pulse began to rise, not wild, not panicked, just steady and undeniable, like something old waking up inside her. The words in front of her didn't belong to a janitor's shift. They belonged to another life. A life with lecture halls and fluorescent law library lamps and casebooks highlighted in yellow and blue. A life she had folded away carefully, like a winter coat she couldn't afford to wear anymore. Her mother's oxygen machine, past due notices, hospital parking receipts, 2 jobs, night classes abandoned halfway through. Dreams put in storage because survival had a louder voice. All of that pressed quietly behind her ribs now as she stared at line 14 of the contract and felt the floor tilt beneath the weight of what she was seeing. Around the room, impatience began to stir. Chairs shifted. A pen tapped once against a notepad. Someone whispered, "Can we please?" But Ava was no longer hearing any of them. She was hearing the sentence on the page as clearly as if it had been spoken out loud. And it said exactly what no one in this room had noticed yet. Her fingers tightened around the paper. Slowly, she rose to her feet. And when she looked up at Daniel Carter, the man who had just told her to pick it up, there was something in her eyes that made the room go completely still. No one in the room understood why she had not bent back down. That was the first thing they felt before anything else. Not curiosity, not concern, just confusion. Because people like Ava Johnson were supposed to move quietly through spaces like this, unnoticed, unremembered, part of the background like the hum of the air conditioning or the reflection of light on polished glass. But she was still standing, and that changed the temperature of the room in a way no one could explain out loud. Daniel Carter's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger yet, but in recalculation. He was a man who noticed disruptions. He built his entire career on controlling them. And right now, something small and unexpected was refusing to return to its place. "I asked you a question," he said, his tone still controlled, still even, but now carrying a sharper edge beneath it. Ava lifted the page just enough to read the line again, as if confirming what she already knew. The letters did not change. They did not soften. Legal language rarely did. It stayed cold and precise, no matter who it harmed. Her thumb pressed lightly against the margin, leaving a faint smudge where cleaning solution had not fully dried from her skin. She could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips now, steady and grounding, not overwhelming. This was not fear. It was recognition. Across the table, a young analyst leaned toward his colleague and whispered something under his breath, eyes flicking toward Ava with a mix of disbelief and quiet irritation. A woman near the center of the table exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around a pen as if bracing for something inconvenient. Time was money in this room. And right now, time was being interrupted by someone who was not supposed to matter. Ava finally looked up. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to meet Daniel's gaze with a calm that did not match her uniform. "There is something wrong with this clause," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The words landed clearly, cutting through the silence with a kind of precision that did not belong to hesitation. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the reaction came, not all at once, but in ripples. A short laugh from the far end of the table. A raised eyebrow from one of the senior partners. Someone shifting in their seat, uncomfortable with the direction things were taking. Daniel did not laugh. He did not move. But something in his posture changed, almost too subtle to notice. His shoulders squared slightly. His chin lifted a fraction of an inch. "You are telling me," he said slowly, each word measured, "that something is wrong with a contract reviewed by 3 legal teams, 2 senior partners, and a board that does not make mistakes." Ava did not flinch. "Yes, sir," she replied. The room reacted again, this time sharper. A quiet scoff. A shake of the head. One of the executives leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as if settling in to watch something unfold that he was certain would not end well for her. Ava lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, but to the page still in her hand. The line was still there, still hidden in plain sight, still waiting for someone to see it for what it was. When she looked back up, her voice remained steady. "It shifts the liability," she said. "If the agreement fails, your company takes the full legal responsibility." The words hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Even the quiet sounds in the room seemed to pause. Daniel's expression did not change immediately, but his eyes flickered, just once, toward the document in her hand. Not fully, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough. And for the first time since she had stepped into the room, Ava felt it. Not power, not control, just a small, undeniable shift. Like a door that had been closed for a very long time had just moved an inch. And no one knew yet what was on the other side. Daniel Carter did not reach for the document right away. That was what made everyone around the table hold their breath without realizing it. A man like him was never careless with movement. Every pause meant something. Every silence had a purpose. He stood at the head of the room with one hand resting lightly against the back of his leather chair, his wedding band catching a thin stripe of white light from above, while the city beyond the glass dissolved deeper into rain. Somewhere below, traffic moved in tiny silver streams between buildings that looked almost unreal from 32 stories up. But inside the conference room, the air had gone heavy and still, as if even the weather outside had stopped to listen. Ava remained where she was, the contract page, held steady in her hand, her shoulders square though she could feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing against her skin. She had spent years learning how to stand still when people wanted her to shrink. Grocery lines, security desks, reception counters, college financial aid offices where her questions got answered with half smiles and lowered expectations. There was a certain kind of silence that followed black women through rooms built by money and certainty. A silence that said, "You are here, but you are not supposed to be." She knew it well. She also knew what it meant to speak anyway. Daniel finally extended his hand. "Let me see it," he said. The room shifted almost imperceptibly. Not relief. Not yet. More like surprise that he had not dismissed her outright. Ava crossed the distance to the table in 4 quiet steps, careful and measured, the wheels of her cleaning cart still facing the wall where she had left it. She placed the page in front of him without letting her hand tremble. Up close, the room smelled faintly of coffee, printer toner, and expensive cologne. The table itself was black walnut, smooth as glass under the recessed lights, with the kind of finish that made fingerprints look like intrusions. Daniel lowered his gaze to the page. Around him, no one spoke. Not the attorneys. Not the analysts. Not the board members who had spent the last 40 minutes nodding through a merger worth more money than Ava's family had seen in generations. His eyes moved once across the text. Then again, slower. Ava watched the change arrive in him the way a storm moves over water. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just visible enough if you knew where to look. His jaw tightened first, then the small muscle near his temple. He read the line a third time. This time, his fingers pressed more firmly into the edge of the paper. At the far end of the table, Richard Langley, one of the senior attorneys and a man who wore confidence like a second suit, gave a dry little chuckle. "Daniel," he said, leaning back with practiced ease. "With all due respect, we are not stopping a billion-dollar acquisition because someone from facilities thinks she found a legal issue." The word facilities landed in the room like a label being stapled onto Ava's chest. It was not shouted. It did not need to be. It carried the exact kind of polished disrespect that men like Richard had spent entire careers perfecting. Ava did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Daniel. Because for the first time since she entered the room, he was no longer looking at her like she had interrupted his morning. He was looking at the page like it had just betrayed him. "Who drafted subsection C?" Daniel asked, still staring down at the contract. Richard's smile thinned. "Our outside counsel prepared the final revision, but the language was reviewed." Reviewed by who? Daniel's voice stayed low, but something in it had changed. The room felt it instantly. It was no longer the voice of a man being inconvenienced. It was the voice of a man beginning to suspect he had almost been made a fool in his own boardroom. Richard straightened in his chair. "Our team signed off on the compliance language." Ava saw it then. Not in Daniel. In everyone else. The shift. The tiny fracture in the hierarchy. The same people who had looked through her 10 minutes ago were now looking at her like she had become dangerous. Not because she was loud. Not because she was emotional. But because she had seen something before they did. And in rooms like this, that was the one thing power never forgave easily. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured slowly, like pressure building beneath a surface no one wanted to admit was already cracking. Daniel Carter's fingers remained on the edge of the document, but he was no longer reading it the way he had before. Now he was dissecting it. Every word, every comma, every carefully constructed phrase that had once looked like protection and now revealed itself as something else entirely. The room shifted again, more noticeably this time. Chairs adjusted. Someone cleared their throat. The quiet confidence that had filled the space earlier began to thin, replaced by something tighter, more uncertain. Ava stood a few feet from the table, her hands now empty, her posture unchanged, but inside she could feel the weight of what she had set in motion. There was no stepping back from this. No soft correction. No polite apology that would return things to the way they were. This was a line crossed, and everyone in the room knew it. Daniel finally lifted his gaze, not toward Ava, but toward Richard Langley. "Read it out loud," he said. The request was simple. The impact was not. Richard blinked once, clearly not expecting to be put on display in his own domain. "Daniel, I assure you, the language is standard. Read it," Daniel repeated, his tone still controlled, but now carrying something heavier beneath it. Not anger. Not yet. Authority sharpened by doubt. The kind that made people uncomfortable because it meant the rules in the room were shifting. Richard hesitated for half a second too long. It was small, almost invisible, but it was enough. Enough for everyone watching to register that something was off. Slowly, he leaned forward, pulling the document closer. His eyes scanned the page, faster at first, then slower. Ava watched him carefully. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Not validation. Not recognition. Just truth catching up to itself. Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his posture as if trying to regain control of the room through sheer habit. "Subsection C," he began, his voice measured, but lacking the ease it had carried earlier. "In the event of post-acquisition liability arising from pre-existing or undisclosed financial exposure, The acquiring entity assumes full responsibility for all legal and financial consequences, regardless of origin. He stopped, just for a second, then continued, a little more carefully now. This clause ensures operational continuity and protects the transition process. No, Ava said quietly. The interruption was not loud, but it landed harder than anything spoken so far. Every head turned toward her again. Richard's expression tightened. Excuse me. Ava did not raise her voice. She did not step forward. She simply spoke. It does not protect the transition, she said. It transfers all liability to the acquiring company, even if the risk was created before the deal, even if it was hidden. The words settled into the room with a clarity that made them impossible to ignore. Daniel's eyes shifted back to the page. This time, he did not just read the clause. He traced it, slowly, line by line, as if peeling back something layered beneath the surface. The seconds stretched. No one interrupted. No one moved. Even the city outside seemed quieter now, the rain soft against the glass, the skyline blurred into a distant gray that felt miles away from the tension inside the room. Then Daniel exhaled. Not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to signal a decision forming. If this holds, he said, almost to himself, then we absorb everything. No one answered him, because they all understood what that meant. Lawsuits, debt, collapse. Not immediately, not loudly, but inevitably. Ava felt it again. That shift, stronger now, not just a crack in the room, but a fracture running through it. The hierarchy was no longer solid. The certainty was gone. And for the first time since she had walked in pushing a cleaning cart, the most powerful man in the room was no longer the one controlling the outcome. The truth was, and it had come from someone no one had bothered to see. The room should have turned in Ava's favor after that. It should have. Truth had a way of sounding obvious once it was spoken out loud. But power did not surrender just because it had been caught. It resisted first. It protected itself. And Richard Langley had spent too many years in rooms like this to let a woman in a maintenance badge become the reason his judgment was being questioned. He leaned back slowly, folding his hands with the deliberate calm of someone trying to look unaffected while his mind raced for a way to recover. This is being exaggerated, he said, his voice smoother now, almost amused, as if the tension in the room were a misunderstanding beneath him. The clause can be revised before execution. It is not uncommon for language like this to appear in draft form. A few shoulders around the table loosened at that, not because they believed him fully, but because people in expensive rooms often preferred a comfortable lie to an inconvenient truth. Ava felt the shift immediately. The relief. The collective desire to move on. To smooth this over. To restore the hierarchy before it embarrassed itself any further. Daniel's eyes remained on the page, but he had gone still again, and that stillness was no longer neutral. Ava knew this kind of moment. It was the dangerous one. The one where the truth could either settle into the room or get swallowed whole by status, tone, and polished language. She could stay quiet now. She had already done more than anyone expected. More than anyone would have forgiven if she had been wrong. But the line on. The page was not the only thing she had noticed. There had been another detail. Smaller, buried deeper. The kind of thing someone only saw if they had once spent nights studying contracts under flickering fluorescent lights while vending machine coffee cooled beside open textbooks and rent notices waited at home. Her fingers curled lightly at her sides. Then she spoke again. It is not a draft issue, she said. The room stiffened. Richard's expression hardened instantly, though only around the eyes. You need to stop, he said, and this time the smoothness in his voice had cracked just enough to reveal the command underneath. You have already said more than enough. Ava turned her head toward him for the first time. Her face remained calm, but her voice carried something firmer now. Then explain why the indemnity appendix uses different language from the primary clause. No one moved. Richard blinked. Just once. It was quick, but Daniel saw it. Ava knew he did because his head lifted slowly from the page. What did you say? He asked. Ava inhaled once, steady and controlled. The appendix contradicts subsection C, she said. The main clause says Carter Global absorbs the liability. But the indemnity language in the back only protects the seller from disclosed losses, not concealed ones. That means if they hit exposure before the acquisition, and this closes, your company still carries it. There is no real protection here. It only looks balanced if you do not compare both sections side by side. The room went completely still. Not performative stillness. Not polite silence. Real stillness. The kind that arrives when people realize the person they dismissed might know exactly what she is talking about. Daniel turned the pages himself this time. Faster now, flipping to the appendix with a precision that made the paper snap softly against the table. His eyes moved across the language. Once, twice, then stopped. Richard opened his mouth, but Daniel raised a hand without looking at him. It was a small gesture, barely emotion at all, but it shut the room down instantly. Ava could hear her own breathing now, could feel the pulse at the base of her throat. She did not look away. She had not come this far to make herself smaller just because the room had finally noticed her. Daniel read in silence for several more seconds. Then, he placed both hands flat on the table and looked directly at Richard Langley. "Did you miss this?" he asked quietly. "Or were you hoping I would?" No one in the room would remember to breathe for the next 5 seconds. And Ava Johnson, still standing in her work shoes on polished marble, realized the moment had moved past embarrassment now. This was no longer about a clause. It was about who had been trusted, and who had actually been paying attention. The question stayed in the air like a crack in glass. No one rushed to fill it. No one dared. Richard Langley sat motionless for a beat too long, and in rooms like this, hesitation was louder than shouting. His polished confidence, the kind that had carried him through decades of boardrooms and private clubs and airport lounges where men like him made decisions over whiskey and handshakes, had begun to fray at the edges. Daniel Carter was still standing with both palms on the table, his head slightly lowered, his eyes locked on Richard with a focus so still it felt almost surgical. Outside the windows, the rain had softened into a fine silver mist, streaking down the glass in thin, crooked lines. The skyline beyond had turned pale and distant, softened by weather and height. But inside the conference room, every detail had become painfully sharp. The brushed steel water pitchers, the cold white glow reflected in the black walnut table, the faint crease in Daniel's cuff where he had rolled his sleeve back half an inch without noticing. Ava stood where she had been, just far enough from the table to remain outside the circle of power, just close enough now to feel the room turning around her. Her heartbeat had finally begun to slow, not because the danger had passed. It had not. But because there was a strange kind of calm that arrived when the truth had already left your mouth and there was nothing left to protect. She had spent so much of her life measuring herself for other people's comfort, speaking softly, taking up less room, knowing exactly how far she could go before a room decided she had forgotten her place. But now there was no place left to return to. She had crossed it, and somehow, standing there in a Navy work uniform with a bent badge and damp hands that still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, she felt steadier than anyone in the room wearing silk or Italian wool. Richard finally shifted in his chair. He reached for the contract again, but his fingers lacked the ease they had before. "There may have been a drafting inconsistency," he said, his voice quieter now, less certain, as if even he could hear how thin the words sounded. "But there is no evidence of intent." Daniel did not answer him immediately. He straightened slowly, then looked down once more at the page in front of him, not as a businessman now, but as a man replaying a moment he had nearly stepped into without question. His signature, his company, his name, everything he had built resting one pin stroke away from someone else's trap. The realization did not come with anger first. It came with stillness. Heavy, sober, humiliating stillness. Ava saw it settle over him like weight. The kind that changed a person more quietly than regret ever announced itself. For the first time since she had entered the room, Daniel looked toward her without arrogance. Not apology, not warmth, just something rawer and harder to hide. Recognition. It was subtle, a slight pause in his gaze, a carefulness that had not been there before. The room noticed it too. They all did. And that was what made the silence feel different now. Not hostile, not dismissive. Reverent in a way none of them would have admitted out loud. The woman they had treated like part of the furniture had just seen what all of them missed. Ava lowered her eyes briefly, not out of shame, but because the moment had suddenly become too bright somehow, too exposed. Light from the window had shifted across the floor, stretching pale across the marble until it reached the edge of her shoe. She watched it for a second. The thin silver line of it. The quiet. The rain. The distant murmur of thunder somewhere beyond the city. It all felt unreal and deeply ordinary at the same time, as if the world had not changed at all, and yet something fundamental had tilted inside this room forever. Daniel's voice, when it came, was lower than before. "Everyone out," he said. No one moved at first, not because they had not heard him, but because they had. Then chairs slid back. Laptops closed. Papers gathered. People rose with the stiff, careful silence of those leaving a room where something important had just happened and they were not yet sure how to speak about it. Ava did not move. Neither did Daniel. And as the door opened and the first wave of executives disappeared into the hallway, she realized this was no longer the same story that had begun with a command and a stack of papers on the floor. Something quieter had taken its place now. Something heavier. And whatever came next would not be about whether she had been right. It would be about what a man like Daniel Carter did after realizing the person he looked down on had just saved him from himself. The conference room felt larger once everyone else had left. Not emptier. Larger. As if silence itself had stretched into the corners and settled over the glass, the leather chairs, the untouched coffee, the city beyond the windows. Ava could hear things now that had disappeared beneath the tension before. The low mechanical hum of the ventilation system, the faint tap of rainwater trailing down the glass, the soft electric buzz from the recessed lights above the table. Daniel Carter stood near the head of the room with the contract still open in front of him, one hand resting on the back of his chair, the other hanging at his side, as though he had forgotten what to do with it. He looked older in the quiet. Not weak. Not diminished. Just stripped of the smooth certainty that had made him seem untouchable an hour ago. Ava remained near the side wall, where her cleaning cart waited exactly where she had left it, the chrome handle catching pale window light. The yellow caution sign folded beside the mop bucket suddenly looked absurd in a room where billion-dollar decisions had almost collapsed because no one bothered to read what they were signing. She did not know if she should leave. She did not know if she was still employed. She did not know if the next 5 minutes would end with gratitude, dismissal, or a security escort to the elevator. But she stayed where she was, because something in the room had not finished unfolding yet. Daniel finally looked up, not at the contract this time. At her. Fully. "Where did you learn to read contracts like that?" he asked. There was no accusation in his voice now. No edge. Just a quiet kind of disbelief that sounded more personal than professional. Ava hesitated, not because she did not know the answer, but because she had spent years teaching herself not to offer pieces of her life to people who only noticed her once she became useful. Still, the truth was already here. It had already crossed the room. "Columbia," she said. Daniel's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Law school." Ava nodded once. 2 years. The silence that followed was different from the others. Softer. More human. Daniel's eyes moved over her face again, but now as if he were trying to reconcile two images that refused to fit together. The woman in a cleaning uniform. The woman who had just dismantled a legal trap no one in his executive team had caught. "What happened?" he asked. Ava let out the smallest breath, barely more than air. Her fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the microfiber cloth still tucked into her palm. "My mother got sick," she said. "Stage 4 ovarian cancer. Insurance covered some of it. Not enough." She kept her voice even, but the words still carried the weight of fluorescent hospital hallways, unpaid bills stacked in kitchen drawers, microwave coffee at 2 in the morning, and the quiet humiliation of leaving one life behind so another person could survive a little longer. "I worked nights. Took fewer classes. Then I stopped going altogether." Daniel said nothing. Ava was grateful for that. She did not want sympathy from him. Sympathy was easy. Respect was harder. And for the first time, she thought he might finally understand the difference. He looked down at the contract again, then back at her. "You saw this in under a minute," he said. It was not praise. It was astonishment wrapped in fact. Ava gave the faintest shake of her head. "I saw it because I used to train myself to look for what people hide in plain language." Daniel's jaw tightened once more, but not with pride this time. With realization. Not about the clause. About her. About what it meant that someone he had reduced to a uniform and a task had once sat in classrooms he would have respected, spoken the language he trusted, and carried a mind his own people had failed to match. The truth had become bigger than the contract now. It was no longer only about what almost happened to his company. It was about what he had looked at and refused to see. Daniel took a slow breath and straightened. You were right, he said. For words. Quiet. Unadorned. No speech. No excuse attached to them. But in a room like this, from a man like him, they landed heavier than any apology could have. Ava did not smile. She did not soften. She simply stood there, the city gray behind her, the marble floor cold beneath her shoes, and let the words exist between them. Because sometimes justice did not arrive with triumph. Sometimes it arrived as stillness, as truth, as a powerful man finally forced to say out loud what the room should have known from the beginning. And Daniel Carter, standing in his own boardroom with rain tracing silver lines down the windows behind him, had finally seen the woman he had once told to pick something up. Only now he understood what she had really been holding all along. Daniel did not move for several seconds after he said it. The words had left his mouth, but something in him was still catching up to them, still adjusting to the weight of what they meant. You were right. It sounded simple. It was not. Ava could feel it in the way the room held its breath again, even though there was no one left to witness it. Recognition, once spoken, changed the shape of everything around it. The table, the distance between them, the silence. Daniel reached for the contract slowly, then closed it with deliberate care, aligning the edges as if precision could restore control to a moment that had already shifted beyond it. He placed both hands on the folder, pressing lightly, not out of force, but out of habit. Order, structure, containment. The things he had relied on his entire life to keep the world predictable. But nothing about the last 15 minutes had been predictable. Ava watched him without stepping closer. She did not need to. Whatever this moment was, it did not require her to move. She had already done what mattered. The rest belonged to him. Daniel lifted the folder and walked around the table, stopping a few feet in front of her. Not too close. Not too far. Close enough to acknowledge her presence. Far enough to respect it. It was a distance that had not existed before. He held the folder out slightly, not offering it, just holding it as if it now represented something more than paper. If you had not said anything, he began, his voice quieter now, stripped of the polished edge it carried earlier, we would have signed this within minutes. Ava said nothing. She did not nod. She did not respond. She let him finish. And by the time we realized what it actually meant, he continued, glancing briefly at the folder, it would have been too late to undo it without consequences that would follow this company for years. He paused, the weight of that realization settling fully now. Not theoretical, not abstract, real. Ava could see it in the way his shoulders held tension differently, less rigid, more grounded, like a man recalibrating in real time. Daniel exhaled slowly and lowered the folder to the table beside him. You protected something that people in this room are paid to protect, he said. And you did it without authority, without a title, and without anyone asking you to. Ava's grip tightened slightly around the cloth in her hand, the fabric soft against her fingers, grounding her. She had not thought of it that way. Not as protection, just as something that could not be ignored once she saw it. I did not do it for the company, she said quietly. Daniel looked at her, and for the first time, there was no assumption in his gaze. Just attention. Then why, he asked. Ava held his eyes for a moment, then answered simply. Because it was wrong. The words settled between them with a clarity that did not need elaboration. No explanation about contracts. No mention of risk. Just a line drawn in a place that had nothing to do with profit margins or shareholder value. Daniel absorbed that in silence. It was not the answer he expected, and that made it matter more. He nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something deeper than the situation itself. Then he did something no one in that building had likely seen him do in years. He stepped back, not physically retreating, just creating space. Space that did not position him above her, not below her, just separate, equal in that moment in a way the room had never allowed before. What you did today, he said, does not disappear when this meeting ends. Ava did not respond. She had learned a long time ago that words from people in power could shift quickly once circumstances changed. But something in his tone made her pause. It was not performative. It was not transactional. It sounded like a decision forming rather than a promise being made. Daniel glanced once toward the door, where the hallway beyond remained quiet, then back at her. Neither should you, he added. The sentence was simple, but it carried something that reached beyond the walls of the room. Opportunity. Recognition. A different path. Ava felt it immediately. Not as temptation, not as relief, as weight, because stepping into a new space meant leaving another one behind. And she knew better than anyone what that cost looked like. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain continued its quiet rhythm against the glass. The city moved on below, unaware of the shift that had just taken place 32 floors above it. Ava lowered her gaze briefly, then looked back up. "I still have a shift to finish," she said. Her voice was calm, grounded, the same voice she had used from the beginning. Daniel studied her for a second, then gave the smallest nod. Not disappointment, not surprise, just understanding. And in that quiet exchange, something resolved itself without needing to be named. Not everything had to change in a single moment. Some things could unfold at their own pace. Ava turned and walked back toward her cart, her footsteps soft against the marble, the wheels of the cart catching the light as she reached for the handle. Behind her, Daniel remained where he was, watching, not with control, not with judgment, but with a kind of awareness he had not carried before. And for the first time since the morning began, the room felt balanced. Not by power, not by status, but by something far more difficult to ignore. Truth that had been seen, and a woman who had refused to look away from it. The hallway outside the conference room was quieter than it should have been for a building that never really stopped moving. Ava pushed the cart forward slowly, the soft rubber wheels gliding across the polished floor, leaving no sound behind her except the faint shift of water inside. The bucket with each step. The glass doors closed behind her with a gentle click, sealing the room and everything that had happened inside it into a space that already felt distant, like something that belonged to a different version of the day. The overhead lights in the corridor stretched in a straight line ahead, bright and consistent, reflecting faintly off the floor like a path that did not change no matter who walked it. Ava kept her pace steady, not fast, not slow. The same pace she had used every night, every shift, every quiet hour when no one noticed her moving through spaces that were never meant for her to stay in. But something inside her had shifted. Not loudly, not in a way anyone else would see. Just enough that the air felt different against her skin, like she was no longer shrinking to fit inside it. She reached the corner where the hallway opened toward the service elevators and paused for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the cart handle. To her right, through another wall of glass, the city stretched wide and gray beneath a sky that was beginning to clear, the rain thinning into scattered drops that caught the light and disappeared before they reached the ground. Cars moved below in quiet lines. People crossed intersections with umbrellas half lowered now, the storm already passing behind them. Life continuing, unchanged, unaware. Ava watched it for a second, her reflection faint in the glass, layered over the skyline. The uniform, the badge, the woman who had stood in a boardroom and spoken anyway. Both versions of her existed at the same time, and neither canceled the other out. Somewhere behind her, footsteps approached, measured and unhurried. She did not turn right away. She did not need to. She recognized the rhythm now. Daniel Carter stopped a few feet behind her, not close enough to interrupt the space she had claimed, not distant enough to pretend he had not followed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city filled the silence for them. The hum of traffic, the distant echo of something mechanical deep within the building, the soft sound of water dripping from the edge of a ledge outside. Daniel finally spoke, his voice quieter than it had ever been inside the conference room. "Human resources will want to talk to you," he said. Ava nodded slightly, her eyes still on the city. "I figured." There was no tension in her voice, no urgency, just acknowledgement. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, then added, "That conversation will not be about your job here." Ava turned her head just enough to look at him. Not fully, just enough to catch the meaning behind the words. He was not offering a reward. Not exactly. He was opening a door. The kind that had once closed on her without warning. The kind she had learned not to expect would ever open again. Ava held his gaze for a brief moment, then looked back out at the skyline. The clouds were breaking now, thin strips of light pushing through, touching the tops of buildings in a way that made everything look softer, less rigid. "I will think about it," she said. Daniel nodded once. He did not press. He did not explain. For once, he understood that some decisions did not belong to him. Ava adjusted her grip on the cart and began to move again, turning toward the service elevator, the familiar route waiting for her, just as it always had. The doors at the end of the hallway opened with a soft chime as she approached, revealing the small, metal interior that smelled faintly of detergent and steel. She stepped inside and turned the cart carefully, pressing the button for the lower floors. As the doors began to close, she caught one last glimpse of the hallway, of Daniel standing where she had left him, still, watching, but not calling her back. The doors slid shut with a quiet finality, and the elevator began its slow descent. The light above flickered once, then steadied. Ava leaned lightly against the handle of the cart, her reflection faint in the brushed metal wall, her breathing even, her posture unchanged. No music, no applause, no dramatic ending, just the soft hum of the elevator moving downward, carrying a woman who had not been seen, who had spoken anyway, and who now carried something no one in that building could take from her. The quiet certainty of knowing exactly who she was, whether anyone else chose to see it or not.